A history of Hispanic achievements in America is the rich legacy of the 45 million Hispanic Americans living in the United States. It is a legacy that started 500 years ago when Christopher Columbus stepped ashore in the New World. It is a legacy of remarkable journeys of discovery by men like Francisco Coronado, Hernando de Soto, and Don Pedro Menendez. They were followed by others who carved out a civilization in the harsh, untamed wilderness of what would become the United States. It is a legacy that saw Spain's empire crumble, and in the mid-19th century saw Hispanics become American citizens. In the 20th century, there were great individual Hispanic achievers who fought for equality in education, politics, and business. This series is the untold story of Hispanic American achievements that are now part of the great American culture of the 21st century.
Hello, I'm Patricia Lopez, and welcome to the first episode of A History of Hispanic Achievement in America. The story of Hispanic achievement in America goes back over 500 years. The first part of that story is one of danger, exploration, and discovery. Before the first English colonists arrived at Jamestown in 1607, men such as Christopher Columbus and intrepid Spanish conquistadors Ponce de León, Hernán Cortés, Francisco Coronado, and Hernando de Soto had explored the Caribbean islands, Mexico, Florida, and America's desert Southwest. But this first 100 years in the Hispanic history in America was also a time of settlement and the establishment of the Hispanic tradition in the New World. We shall see in this first program that it was a time when the tradition of tolerance towards Native people had developed. It would merge two cultures into one great Hispanic culture. Everyone knows the story of Christopher Columbus setting sail from Spain. But what is not so well known is the voyage would not have been successful without the 90 unknown Spanish sailors who made the dangerous journey with him. The achievement of discovering the New World belonged as much to them as it did to Columbus.
The history of the United States started in places like Florida and the deserts of New Mexico and Texas. It started when conquistadors like Ponce de León and Hernando de Soto landed on the shores of Florida. However, what preceded these men's adventures of discovery was the journey of Christopher Columbus. That journey was also a heroic feat of discovery for the 90 Spanish sailors who made the trip. They traveled on perhaps the most famous ships the world has ever known: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Santa Maria, captained by Christopher Columbus, and her two sister ships set sail on August 3, 1492, from Palos, Spain. 69 days later, they landed at the present-day island of San Salvador. Columbus thought he had made it to India, and even named the Caribbean islands the Indies. Now looking for gold, Columbus traveled from San Salvador to present-day Cuba, then to Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. On March 15, 1493, Columbus completed his journey and returned to Spain. Thus, America's Hispanic tradition began. Spain would set its sights on the New World, changing the balance of political power on the planet forever. Columbus himself was a man of mystery, whose origins are still debated today. The legend has it that Columbus had to convince King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella of Spain to outfit 3 ships: the Niña, captained by Vicente Inez Pinzon; the Pinta, owned and captained by Martin Alonso Pinzon; and his own flagship, the Santa Maria, for a voyage west to find the Far East, a radical notion at the time, since other nations were sailing east around Africa, looking for a sea route to India and China. What was not fanciful legend was the actual trip across the Atlantic and back. Ocean travel at this time was dangerous. Sailors went off into the unknown without maps and with no ability to chart their location using longitude and latitude. Reaching a place had to be done by dead reckoning, an inexact navigation that was more luck than anything else. The odds of Columbus succeeding were very low. But Columbus did have some advantages. The ships he and his men traveled on were called caravels. The sleek design of these vessels was especially suited for crossing the Atlantic because they could sail against the wind at 70 degrees. They also had stern-post rudders, which made them easier to steer. And Columbus had a compass so that he could at least maintain his course. However, the routine of sailing was grueling. Endless tasks of handling the sails and rigging, which were dealt with on the deck. Because the ships were made from wood, water seeped in and had to be pumped out almost continuously. The crew cooked on dangerous wood-burning stoves. Their meals consisted mainly of a stew of soaked meat or fish, hard biscuits, and watered wine. Because the ships were so small, the Nina was only 74 feet long. The sailors had no crew quarters. They slept on deck in good weather and found a spot in the hold during storms. Only a few officers had bunks. After his historic first voyage, Columbus made 3 more trips to the New World. On his second voyage, September 1493 through June 1496, he established a base at Cuba, which would become Spain's main colony in the Caribbean. Finally, on his third voyage, May 1498 to October 1500, Columbus sailed to Trinidad and then to Venezuela, becoming the first European since the Vikings to set foot on America's mainland. On his fourth and final trip, May 1502 to November 1504, Columbus sailed to Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama. For these explorations, Columbus received from Spain a knighthood, including a coat of arms and the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea. By the time Columbus died in 1506, the Hispanic tradition in the Americas was fully underway. For the next 100 years, Spain had the New World to itself. Conquistadors and Catholic missionaries would conquer and convert the native populations to Christianity. More importantly, the Spanish colonists would intermarry, leading to the vast 21st century Hispanic population of nearly 500 million people spanning 2 continents.
Within 20 years of Columbus's discovery, thousands of Spain's finest soldiers and adventurers willingly left their homes to embark on a dangerous journey for wealth and adventure to a new world where nothing was certain. They became known as the Conquistadors. One of these brave individuals would be the first to step onto what would become the United States.
The beaches of Florida's Atlantic coast are now home to vacationers escaping the harsh winters of the north. But the first Europeans to set foot upon these pristine sands were Hispanic explorers nearly 500 years ago. Indeed, a map of the southern coastline of the United States reveals a legacy of Hispanic names: St. Augustine, Punta Gorda, Pensacola, Galveston, Corpus Christi. These places were named by intrepid Hispanic explorers who sought not only a western sea passage to China, but land for colonies. Colonies that would enable Spain to settle the new world Christopher Columbus had discovered. Among the first of these explorers was Juan Ponce de Leon, the first European to set foot upon the southern coast of what would become the United States of America. As the 15th century drew to a close, Spain and Portugal were in a tight competition to find the sea route to India and China. Though the risks were high, the rewards were spectacular. Even a modestly successful voyage trading for spices and silks, could return 3,000% to investors. Encouraged by Portugal's maritime prince, Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors sailed east around Africa's Cape Horn. Spain, on the other hand, led by Columbus, took the more daring course and sailed west. Though Columbus did not realize his dream of establishing a trade route to China, he found something much more important: gold and land. Gold was something Spain could use to support its spreading empire in Europe. Land meant colonies and wealth gained in trading for raw materials. In less than a generation, Spain was busy exploring her windfall. Ponce de Leon turned out to be the first of many adventurers who would expand Spain's American colonial sphere. Ponce de Leon was born in Santervas, Spain, around 1460 and fought in the wars to oust the Moors from Granada in southern Spain. In 1493, he joined Columbus's second expedition to the West Indies, staying in the Caribbean where he joined the ranks of the Hispanic conquistadors, who sought their fortunes in the New World. Conquistadors were military leaders who invaded foreign lands and conquered the inhabitants. Ponce de Leon was part of a tradition that went back thousands of years to men like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and William the Conqueror. When Ponce de Leon heard of gold on the neighboring island of Puerto Rico, he organized an expedition to the island and conquered it. Appointed governor in 1509, he established the oldest European settlement on the island. 4 years later, Ponce de Leon outfitted another military expedition to find the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. Along the way, he landed on the east coast of Florida at what was to become St. Augustine and claimed the territory for Spain. He named this land La Florida in honor of the Easter Sunday known as Pascua de Florida, Feast of Flowers. Later it was shortened to Florida when it became the United States' 27th state. Supposedly, Ponce de Leon was searching for the lost fountain of youth. Perhaps associated with one of Florida's many spectacular springs, the fountain of youth was said to give everlasting life and health to whomever drank from its miraculous waters. But such tales are fanciful. Like the conquistadors at this time, Ponce de Leon was searching for gold. Although he did not find any, he did find something just as valuable: the Gulf Stream current. In the decades that followed, Spanish galleons loaded with treasure from Mexico and Peru would use the Gulf Stream in their return journeys to Spain. Ponce de Leon tried twice more to find the island of Bimini, but was unsuccessful. On his last expedition in 1521, he and a force of 200 men landed on the west coast of Florida. Native American warriors attacked them, and Ponce de Leon was wounded by an arrow. He later died from his wounds in Havana, Cuba, in July 1521. He is now buried in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Frederick Douglass, Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King Jr. were all part of a great legacy of civil rights in America. But there was a man who preceded all these men, and his achievement was even greater because he was a first. Bartolomé de las Casas was the man who started the concept of putting an end to prejudice based on race and skin color.
Unlike European whites and African blacks, or even Native Americans, Hispanic American origins are not so easily defined. However, go to any city in the United States, and you will see Hispanic men and women, like all Americans, working at jobs from professionals such as doctors, teachers, and lawyers, to construction workers and secretaries. Their children attend public and private schools. They own their own homes, pay taxes, and take part in America's politics. Their physical features often show the blending of Spanish Europeans, American Indians, and Africans. How did this come to be? 500 years ago, the Spanish colonists and the Native American tribes lived very separate lives, and they clashed in a war of cultures that almost led to the extinction of Native Americans. Then one man, a Catholic priest, devoted his life in a holy mission to end racism in Spain's colonies. That man was Bartolomé de las Casas, Europe's earliest and most courageous voice for Native American civil rights. His life's work would ultimately lead to the blending of distinct cultures into one vast Hispanic community. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus waded ashore on the Caribbean island of San Salvador, he encountered the Arawak Indians. He noted in his report to Queen Isabella of Spain, "Their manners are decorous and praiseworthy." But very soon, the peaceful relations between the two cultures deteriorated. Many of the Arawak succumbed to diseases brought over by the explorers. The rest, the Spanish colonists, enslaved and forced to mine for gold and to work on sugar plantations. Within a few generations, the Arawak Indians were wiped out. This pattern of conquest continued when Spain's explorers reached the North American mainland almost 30 years later. Then, even though conquistador Hernán Cortés defeated the Aztec Empire in 1521, and other Indian empires followed swiftly, large Native American populations remained. As Spain spread north, America's southwest Indian tribes, Havasupai, Pima, and Pueblo, also came under Spanish rule. Again, Spain quickly established political control by implementing two powerful laws known as the encomienda system and the repartimiento. The first made grants of Indian labor to conquistadors. The second forced Indians to work colonists' lands in what often amounted to slave labor gangs in exchange for protection and secular and religious education. These conditions might have led to isolated Native American populations, as they did 200 years later with the English colonies. Except for one man, Bartolomé de las Casas. De las Casas was born in Sevilla, Spain, in 1474, the son of a man who later became rich soldiering with Columbus in the West Indies. De las Casas attended Spain's Salamanca University, where he studied both divinity and law, though he only received a law degree. In 1502, de las Casas went to the West Indies, where he would make his fortune under the encomienda system. But in 1510, he had an epiphany. The encomienda system and the repartimiento were wrong. He freed the Indians on his plantation and dedicated his life to humanizing the Spanish colonial system. That year, at age 36, de las Casas entered the priesthood, becoming the first priest ordained in the colonies. For the rest of his life, de las Casas traveled throughout the Spanish colonies, preaching against land confiscation and slave labor. Though de las Casas did not prevail in his fight to end the abuses of the colonial system, he did help turn the Catholic Church into a defender of the Native Americans. As a result, Spanish friars and priests started missions where the two peoples came together and formed a hybridized religious and social identity, mixing Catholicism and Spanish culture with Native American culture and beginning the process of mestizaje, the blending of Spanish and Indian civilizations. But while the Church led the way in bringing two cultures together in religious and political matters, the greatest blending occurred because the Spanish colonists did not scorn intermarriage with Native Americans the way English colonists did. The greatest mixing occurred among the Spanish men and Indian women. As a result, most Mexican Americans are mestizos, descendants of both the Spanish colonists who settled Mexico in the American Southwest and Native Americans. Many Puerto Ricans and Cubans are descendants of Spanish colonists and black slaves. In the present century, Hispanics are the fastest growing minority in the United States, and they account for the greatest number of new businesses. In the 21st century, Bartolomé de las Casas' vision has produced a vital, non-racist American subculture that is flourishing in all aspects of American life.
The most successful of the conquistadors was Hernán Cortés. His daring leadership brought down the cruel and tyrannical Aztec Empire, and in the process, Cortés established the Spanish Empire in North America, including what would become the southern part of the United States.
He was born into a noble family in Medellin, Spain, in 1485. Yet, at the age of 19, he left home for a life of adventure in the newly discovered lands of the Caribbean. His unflagging courage and audacious military tactics brought one great Indian empire to its knees and enabled Spain to begin a century-long domination of Europe. His far-reaching vision would pave the way for 300 years of Spanish sovereignty over Mexico, Central and South America. He was the conquistador Hernán Cortés. The first discovery of the Americas mainland was in Venezuela in 1499. 14 years later, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, after crossing the Isthmus of Panama, waded into the Pacific Ocean and claimed all its waters and shores for Spain. His expedition built homes and began farming, announcing to all that the Spanish were on the mainland to stay. The age of the Spanish conquistador had begun. The greatest of all the conquistadors was Hernán Cortés, a man whose defeat of the Aztec Empire in 1521 would enable Spain to control the southern half of North America for 300 years. Indeed, Cortés's victory very nearly succeeded in bringing most of North America under Spain's dominance. Ironically, one of the reasons for his tactical success would later keep Spain from exploiting its military superiority. In the spring of 1519, Hernán Cortés deliberately disobeyed the governor of Cuba, Diego de Velázquez, and sailed for the recently discovered coast of Mexico with 600 men. After landing at the present-day port of Veracruz, he burned his ships so that his men could not return to Cuba. He then began a swift march to Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, located in Mexico's high central plains. From the start, the Aztecs and their leader, Montezuma II, were overawed by the Spanish invaders. For 10 years, omens had prophesied the destruction of the empire by men dressed similarly to the conquistadors and riding strange animals. When Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, he thought it was the most magnificent city he had ever seen, even more so than the great cities of Europe. Not only was the Aztec civilization wealthy in gold and jewels, the land itself was similar to the Spanish Castilian farming region. Cortés immediately took Montezuma II hostage and attempted to rule through the monarch. But the Aztecs revolted, and it was 2 years before Cortés gained absolute control. After the conquest, King Charles I of Spain appointed Cortés governor and captain general of Mexico. Cortés renamed the land New Spain and went on to found new cities and extend Spain's rule throughout the country. Though Cortés's exploits appeared to be heroic, he and his men had tremendous advantages. The Aztecs had been cruel leaders. They also demanded from their weaker neighbors heavy tribute, as well as men and women for religious sacrifices. Cortés's march to the heart of the Aztec Empire was like a march of liberation, and he gained allies for his cause. But it was the Spaniards' weapons that made the difference between victory and defeat. The soldiers wore armor and were equipped with steel weapons, halberds, sabers, and the arquebus. The arquebus was a smooth-bore firearm that was the forerunner to the musket and rifle. it made a terrifying explosion. But the horse was the greatest of all the Spanish weapons. The sight of saber-wielding soldiers attacking on horseback sent even the most courageous Aztec warrior fleeing. In the years that followed, the horse would continue to be a devastating weapon. Indeed, the Iberian Mustang, bred in Spain's harsh interior highlands, was well suited to the desert-like conditions of Mexico and America's southwest. Able to live on the sparse grasses of the New World and scant water, the animals could easily carry armored cavalry over Mexico's dry, high plains and beyond. Ironically, Cortez's tactical advantage of the horse would prove Spain's undoing as it pushed further north into the desert southwest and Great Plains of North America. As a result of the introduction of the horse to the Great Plains in 1680, a Plains Indian warrior culture would arise to challenge Spain's expansion into North America. Spain would be stymied in its attempts to control North America. Then in 1540, Hernán Cortés returned to Spain, where he died on December 2nd, 1547. Cortés was a remarkable man whose adventures have inspired generations.
This episode chronicles the shift Spanish conquistadors would make from conquerors to explorers. What was to become the United States had no great empire to conquer, no easy goal to be found. But this did not stop such men as De Soto and Coronado from searching. Searching instead of conquering, they became two of the greatest explorers the world would ever see. Then, with no riches to be found, the next wave of Spanish men and women coming to America were faced with the difficult task of building permanent settlements in Florida and New Mexico, all before the English built a single settlement on the East Coast. There was no greater accomplishment than the survival of these new settlements. It was one of the greatest achievements of all time, the greatest corps of discovery the world has ever known, a 4-year odyssey through the southern reaches of the United States. And in his journals lie the only knowledge of an Indian empire that vanished within a generation after his trek ended.
Today, the southeastern United States is the core of the Deep South and former stronghold of the Confederacy. Now tens of millions of people live and work there. But 500 years ago, it was home to swamps, marshes, primeval forests, and fierce Indian tribes. It was a mysterious and unknown area no Hispanic conquistador dared to explore. Yet one man, a man in the tradition of Spain's warrior explorers, would lead an expedition through this untamed wilderness for 3 years. That man was Hernando de Soto, perhaps the most famous European explorer since Marco Polo. In fact, throughout the southeastern U.S., many towns and counties carry his name. In an expedition that would not be rivaled until 260 years later by Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery, De Soto led a force of 600 men across 10 southern states and even as far north as Indiana and Michigan. But it was here in present-day Florida that he came ashore in 1539 to begin his expedition, seeking his fortune and glory for Spain. By 1530, Spain's first generation of conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, expanded her western empire to include all of Mexico and Central America, where they found immense riches in gold and silver. Then, enticed by rumors of golden cities, lost empires and immense treasures that lay in the unexplored regions of North and South America, the conquistadors sought even greater wealth. The result was that a second generation of explorer warriors, men like Francisco Pizarro, Francisco Coronado, and Hernando de Soto, were driven to explore these regions and see what was there. The greatest of these explorers was De Soto. the man responsible for claiming the southeastern United States for Spain. De Soto was born around 1500 in Spain. At the age of 14, he traveled to the West Indies, where in 1531 he joined Francisco Pizarro in his assault on the Incan Empire. During this expedition, Pizarro made De Soto his second in command. With his share of the treasure, 18,000 ounces of gold, De Soto returned to Spain in 1535. He settled down in Seville and became a wealthy gentleman. But his retirement did not last long. Spurred by twin dreams of finding gold in Florida and a northwest sea passage to China, he sold all his property and prepared an expedition to the New World. In 1537, Spain's King Charles I made De Soto governor of Cuba, granted him the right to conquer Florida, and gave him the right to choose any land he wished in Florida for his own plantation. 2 years later, De Soto was ready to fulfill his dream when he arrived on Florida's west coast, May 30th, 1539. For the next 4 years, his incredible expedition of discovery covered more than 4,000 miles, exploring the southeastern part of what would become the United States, including Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana. But he also crossed the Ohio River into Indiana and Michigan. De Soto maintained meticulous records, providing the only first-hand detailed accounts of the immense cities of the mound builders' vast empire and powerful Indian tribes. De Soto's expedition used the phases of the moon as a means of dating the expedition's events and findings. This novel time dating would make it possible for anyone reading the journals at a later date to know exactly where and when the expedition made its important discoveries. De Soto never found gold or a northwest passage to China. At the same time, the expedition's contacts with the native tribes were disastrous, leading to continuous warfare with everyone the Spanish met. Finally, in June 1542, De Soto succumbed to a fever and died on the banks of the Mississippi River, where he was buried. Though De Soto's expedition ended disastrously, of the 600 men who started out, less than 300 survived. What did survive were his journals, providing a unique early account of a region that would become part of the Spanish Empire and eventually the American South. In fact, so great an American hero was De Soto to Walter P. Chrysler that in 1928, the U.S. automaker named one of his premier model lines De Soto to honor the famous explorer.
The last of the Spanish conquistadors, Francisco Coronado, journeyed as far north as Kansas. For over 2 years, he mapped out an area that would eventually become the 21st century center of Hispanic power in the United States, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. His journey of discovery was surpassed only by his fellow Hispanic explorer, Hernando de Soto.
The great American desert Southwest called to the last of the conquistadors, the last of the warrior explorers who made the harrowing journey across the Atlantic Ocean to find fortune in an untamed new world. More than 200 years would pass before French or English adventurers would set foot again on the lands he discovered for Spain. Because of his daring, Spain would enlarge its holdings in North America to include Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. He was Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. By 1540, Spain had increased its presence in the New World so that it now included all of Mexico, Central America, and portions of South America. But Spain's conquistadors were still not through exploring. Hernando de Soto was already trekking through the southeastern half of North America. At the same time, the Southwest, with its rumors of easy wealth, beckoned Francisco Coronado to his date with destiny. Coronado was born into a noble family in Salamanca, Spain in 1510. At the age of 25, he sailed to Mexico as an assistant to its new viceroy, Don Antonio de Mendoza. He settled in Mexico City, where he married the daughter of the colonial treasurer and became a governor of the province of Nueva Galicia in 1538. It was from here that he would begin the expedition that would bring him everlasting fame as well as disappointment. Rumors of the golden cities of Cibola and Quivira had circulated through Mexico since Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztecs in 1521. In 1540, Coronado was determined to make one last grand discovery for Spain, seeking the fabled golden cities of Cibola. So he led an expedition of 300 Spanish adventurers, 1,000 Indian allies, and 1,500 pack animals into the southwestern deserts and southern plains of North America. For the next 2 years, he traveled through New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and into eastern Kansas. At one point, he and his men were within a couple hundred miles of Hernando de Soto's expedition. Had the two explorers met up, the history of North America might have been very different. However, Coronado's expedition, like de Soto's, would not discover any golden cities or mineral wealth. But the Chronicle of Coronado's adventure, published after his death, provided information about an area of the New World not traversed again until the 18th century, when the French Malay brothers entered the Rocky Mountains in 1741. By this time, Coronado's exploits had led Spain to colonize the land north of the Rio Grande River, from Texas west to California. Finally, in 1848, Coronado's land of discovery would become part of the United States of America. Though Coronado returned to Mexico empty-handed, he continued to be a man of influence in Mexico City until his death in 1554 from injuries sustained during his 1540 expedition.
In the next segment, we shall see that the oldest city in America, St. Augustine, a city that is still thriving 450 years later, was a singular vision of a Hispanic man, Don Pedro Menendez.
This massive Spanish fort, Castillo de San Marcos, was built from 1672 to 1695 in order to protect the oldest permanent European settlement in the United States. Indeed, 55 years before the Pilgrims celebrated the first Thanksgiving, and 211 years before the creation of the United States, an energetic and far-seeing Hispanic naval officer, Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles, along with 800 soldiers and settlers, landed on the east coast of Florida at this spot. That year, 1565, they founded St. Augustine and established the first colony in what would later become the United States of America. Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles was born in 1519 in Aviles, Spain. At age 14, he went to sea, where he quickly distinguished himself. So much so that by the age of 35, he was named the Captain General of Spain's West Indian treasure fleets. In 1554, he commanded the Royal Galleon that bore King Philip II of Spain to England to marry Queen Mary. At that time, Spain had already been in the New World for more than 60 years. She had established 2 successful agricultural colonies on the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The wealth they produced was through sugarcane and tobacco. Spain had also conquered 2 great Native American empires, the Aztecs and the Incas. She had taken their wealth and sent it back to Europe aboard vast treasure fleets. Interestingly, though Florida had been claimed by Spain in 1513 by Ponce de Leon, and again in 1539 by Hernando de Soto, she still had not established any colonies on this part of the North American mainland. However, that changed when France founded the St. Caroline colony on Florida's St. Johns River in 1564. The colony's fort threatened Spain's treasure ships, which sailed along Florida's shoreline returning to Spain. Spain's King Philip II sent his highest admiral, Menendez, and 2,000 sailors, soldiers, and their families to Florida with orders to colonize the land and drive out pirates and settlers of other nations. The plan was for the Spanish Armada to sail up Florida's St. Johns River and attack the French colony directly. However, the French had blockaded the river. Menendez and his troops were forced to land at a smaller harbor south of St. Caroline. Menendez called this new landing St. Augustine. On September 8, 1565, he named the fort officially St. Augustine. This would become the first permanent settlement in all of the United States. But Menendez's troubles with the French were not over. The French explorer Jean Ribault gathered his ships to attack the Spanish colony. But a storm wrecked his ships at present-day Daytona Beach. Taking advantage of this situation, Menendez and 500 men attacked the French fort at St. Caroline and killed all the soldiers, letting only the women and children go free. Now Menendez began to settle the land in earnest. He explored the area and set up a string of forts along Florida's coastline. He made diplomatic treaties with more of the Indian tribes, trading for much-needed supplies. At the same time, Menendez invited missionaries to establish missions throughout Florida to convert the Native Americans to the Catholic faith. He also built outposts on St. Helena Island in South Carolina and on Chesapeake Bay. As more settlers arrived at St. Augustine, a small town grew, Santa Elena, which would become the capital of Spanish Florida. Menendez left Florida in 1567 and returned once more in 1571. He died in Spain on September 17, 1574. But his vision left a unique Spanish legacy in Florida that can still be experienced in the city he founded. St. Augustine, a city that, along with its fort, protected Spain's colonies in the Caribbean from English invaders well into the 17th century.
43 years after the founding of St. Augustine in Florida, Juan Donate founded America's great Hispanic cultural mecca, Santa Fe, New Mexico.
The colonists' journey was arduous, the days long and grueling, through a sun-drenched dry and barren desert, through lands occupied by Indian tribes who viewed travelers with suspicion, to a destination they could not be certain would support them and their families. And yet these brave Hispanic men and women would succeed against famine, drought, and Indian raids to found a thriving settlement. That settlement would grow to become a jewel in Spain's imperial crown, Santa Fe. In 1540, Francisco Coronado went through northern New Mexico looking for the golden city of legend, Cibola. Though he never found any gold, Coronado repeated tales of wealth that were to be found in northern New Mexico. Then 55 years later, in 1595, Spain's King Philip II commissioned a Mexican silver mine owner, Juan de Oñate, to colonize New Mexico and spread Catholicism among the Native Americans. He also named Oñate governor of the colony. 3 years later, Oñate, an explorer warrior in the mold of Cortez and Coronado, led a group of 500 soldiers, colonists, and Franciscan friars, along with 7,000 head of cattle, north from Zacatecas in central Mexico across the Rio Grande River to New Mexico. By July 1598, the colonists established the first capital of New Mexico at San Gabriel Pueblo in the northern Rio Grande Valley, and immediately began building missions to convert the Indians. Like the English colonists at Jamestown, which followed 9 years later in 1607, Oñate's expedition was split into two factions. Historian James E. Ivey described the first faction as entrepreneurs who hoped to make a profit trading with the Indians and prospecting for gold. The other faction consisted of true colonists who hoped to set up ranches and farms and start a thriving settlement. The leadership of the settlers is shrouded in mystery. Most likely, he was a Castilian-born adventurer, Juan Martinez de Montoya, a man described as tall, of good feature, black-bearded. He served as a captain under Oñate and was named alcalde, or mayor of San Gabriel. The surviving records of the time report that early in 1608, he founded a settlement at Santa Fe called Plaza de Santa Fe. That same year, a new governor was appointed for New Mexico, and Juan de Oñate was ordered home. The new governor, Don Pedro de Peralta, was ordered to establish Montoya's Santa Fe settlement as the capital of New Mexico. Sometime in 1609, the new capital was named La Villa Real de la Santa Fe, or the Royal City of the Holy Faith. With its founding, the survival of the New Mexico colony was assured. Santa Fe went on to prosper and become a leading city in Spain's northern provinces. But friction between the Hispanics and Pueblo Indians continued to increase. In 1680, the Pueblos, led by a charismatic chief, Pope, attacked the Spanish settlers and missionaries. Over 400 were killed. The survivors fled south to present-day El Paso, Texas, where they founded new settlements and missions. Hispanic control was not regained until 1692, when the New Mexican governor, Diego de Vargas, recaptured Santa Fe. By the time the Santa Fe Trail opened in 1821, the city had indeed fulfilled the dream of those early colonists, a flourishing model of Hispanic business, trading, and ranching enterprises.
In the 17th century, countless unsung Hispanic families moved into New Mexico, taming the wilderness, establishing ranches, irrigating the arid land, in short, creating a powerful northern economic province for Spain. The legacy of their accomplishments, such as the beautiful Gallegos Hacienda, can still be seen today in Texas, New Mexico, and California.
From Montana to Texas and New Mexico, the large cattle ranch symbolizes the American West. This pattern of central ranch buildings surrounded by huge tracts of grazing land can trace its origins back to the Hispanic pattern of colonization. It is a pattern that extended from Argentina on the southern tip of South America to New Mexico. At the core of this pattern was the Hispanic family. Countless families that heroically tamed and cultivated the American wilderness. One such family was the Gallegos family. At the end of this tree-lined lane is America's oldest inn, a 300-year-old destination for travelers along the El Camino Real, the Royal Road, an ancient highway linking Mexico City with Santa Fe, the capital of the Spanish Empire's far-flung province of New Mexico. Located near Albuquerque, the La Hacienda Grande Bed and Breakfast Inn is perched on what was once a 100-square-mile land grant to the Gallegos family. Its strategic location allowed the Gallegos and later the Montoya families to settle the area surrounding present-day Albuquerque. It was part of the Spanish Crown's new strategy for settling this wild land. Land grants to families, and in some cases entire communities, who promised to improve the land and guard it against Spain's enemies. In 1711, the Spanish administrators granted the Gallegos family 100 square miles around present-day Bernalillo, for a hacienda. The Gallegos hacienda was a product of this new land grant strategy. As hoped, the hacienda grew to become the economic, cultural, and political center for the settlement of Bernalillo near Albuquerque. Haciendas were self-contained landed estates, some as large as the state of Rhode Island. The large extended Hispanic families living on the estates provided their own food, goods, and services, and were like small cities. Indeed, the close-knit family life of those early haciendas is mirrored today in America's Hispanic families. Haciendas also had spirited horse competitions that eventually led to the modern rodeo. In fact, the word rodeo comes from the Spanish word rodear. When Mexico won its freedom from the Spanish Empire, the land grants continued with the original families, and the Mexican government continued distributing land grants to communities and individuals. But after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, many of the original Spanish and Mexican land grants were not honored. Of the over 450 land grant claims in New Mexico, eventually only 1/3 were validated. As for the Gallegos family land grant, it passed to the Montoya family. In the 20th century, the main house can still be seen as this bed and breakfast inn. However, the pattern of land grants established by those pioneering Hispanic families continues in the United States West today in the form of large multi-thousand-acre cattle ranches.
In the third episode of A History of Hispanic Achievement in America, Hispanic American colonists find themselves embroiled in the battle for control of the North American continent. It is a story that finds these colonists defending themselves from British attack and then fighting on the side of the Americans in their struggle for independence in the Revolutionary War. Thanks for watching. I'm Patricia Lopez. For information about how to obtain a copy of this program or the entire DVD gift set of A History of Hispanic Achievement in America, visit our website, www.ambrosevideo.com. That's ambrosevideo.com.